All right, well, welcome. Today, I'm here with wonderful co-authors of an article that's required reading, I think should be required reading for our field, generally speaking, but is certainly required reading in my class. I'm here with Ashley Walsdorf and Lorien Jordan, who are going to talk to us today about their article on white supremacy in the web of family science, implications of the missing spider. The metaphor is amazing. So can you guys say a little bit about where you are right now and then maybe how you knew each other and how you came to write this together?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently in Austin, Texas. I'm working in addiction treatment, but transitioning back to academia very soon as a postdoc at the University of Texas here in Austin. And I met Lorien, who I'll let introduce herself, but we met in our doctoral program. So Lorien was 2 years ahead of me, and at the risk of being dramatic, my idol. So it was really kind of a dream for me, again, dramatic, but truly a dream to be able to become her friend and colleague. Lorien.
Well, I mean, you can't really beat that introduction. So I am at the University of Arkansas, and I teach in the educational statistics program, which I'm actually a qualitative methodologist, so it's a little funny shift for me. But I transitioned. I was teaching at marriage and family therapy at Mercer University, but I transitioned because really research and critical theory was where sort of my jam was, which is part of how this paper, I think, sort of came about. But the friendship and the colleagueship with Ashley really came about as she was 1 or 2 years below me in the cohort system. And she was amazing to work with because she just re-energized me. You know, a PhD program can be a long process and you can kind of lose steam and lose sight. And so having Ashley's energy feed into my own really made, like, I think, a great partnership, but also a beautiful paper.
Yeah. When I was looking at the authorship on the paper, I mean, one of the things I've noticed in my own writing is it does require that synergy or that connection between the co-authors to create together. And this article in particular sort of pulls together theory, as well as some of what we know about research in terms of white supremacy and racism. And you guys, and history, I mean, there's just such a collection of things you guys pulled together. So there must have been quite a connection or collaboration happening to make that possible.
And over a long period of time.
Definitely years in the making. And yeah, I would add that this is certainly a dual shared first authorship paper. You know, Lorien was kind enough to allow me to have my name listed first there, but truly, you know, this would not have happened without a partnership and the kind of depth that you're describing of the historical tracing of white supremacy in the US. That was all Lorien. And so, you know, certainly just want to be clear about authorship and what this is, that was very much a partnership.
Yeah. So can you guys, I mean, I love the metaphor. I think that's a really helpful way for naming something intangible, which seem like, at least you guys sort of you make a case for the metaphors, creating hopefully some clarity about what you're looking for and why it's been so hard to name. So can you guys talk through a little bit about that metaphor and maybe how it came to be and why you picked it in terms of illustrating this issue of white supremacy in the midst of family science, family theory, and how we've sort of missed it for so long, maybe.
Lorien, do you mind if I speak to?
That's all you.
So this could get really long. I'm going to try to truncate my explanation, but so the metaphor is not ours. It comes from Nancy Krieger, who's a social epidemiologist, and she wrote this brilliant paper. I believe it's called Social Epidemiology and the Web of Causation. Has anyone seen the spider? And, you know, it's this incredible paper, and she very tactfully and skillfully, without naming any sort of kind of potential spiders, she's talking about how we have this long history of mapping the web of causation in social science disciplines, but have yet to kind of talk about who's the creator of this really intricate web that we've mapped. And so how I kind of came to this is my advisor in PhD, even though I was in human development and family science, she had an epidemiology background, and several other disciplines. And so as we were working through my comprehensive exams, with my task being to redo a really well-known child development model for minority, Latinx, and African-American kids, you know, we were talking through, I'm trying to redo this model that begins with race and demographic factors as kind of the first position on the model. And, you know, we're talking about all of the things that come before that. So we're talking about, in my context, working primarily with Latinx families, we're talking about documentation and residency status, immigrant status, and looking at all these precursors. And I said, I'm still struggling because something comes before this that, you know, we haven't identified or we're not really seeing in our models. And she said, well, what is it? And I was like, white supremacy, I think. And so we, you know, I kind of went to Lorien with this. I was telling her about how my comprehensive exams were going, and she was like, oh my gosh, like, you know, I have been thinking about the same thing in other ways. And, you know, I think the Krieger paper just sort of, you know, truly kind of blew my mind, and it put words to things that had been kind of swimming around in my brain, but I wasn't able to kind of identify what it was. So yeah, that's from my perspective, how the metaphor kind of came to be a part of, or I guess the central focus of this paper.
Yeah. So the Krieger article, it sounds like is where the metaphor came from, and then there was this recognition as you're working with marginalized community based largely on race. You guys make a point in your paper to talk about racial stratification, not just race as the origin, right? That the issue is the hierarchy that was created, that then being white supremacy, that then sort of created these other factors. So race is not the deciding factor. Racial stratification is. And I thought that was such an important distinction, because sometimes we kind of throw away demographics, like, oh, just control for all of it and then run whatever you want. And we kind of throw out like actually the important part, or neutralize it in some way to find some finding to make meaning out of. But it seems like you're almost saying like, but you left the first part that was the important part. Is that a fair understanding of some of the conclusions you all are, or we're trying to sort of make more visible?
Definitely. So I'm trying to not talk over my dear friend and colleague. The point about racial stratification comes from Linda Burton and her colleagues, and just saying that when we talk about kind of the implications of race, we're not talking about the implications of someone's skin color. It is the racial stratification, the you know, allocation of resources that's disproportionate, and all these other factors. So you know, again, not our idea. I think of this paper and like what we've done as an attempt to be translators, perhaps, that, you know, these are topics that are really well written about in sort of a different frame. And I see what we've done is kind of an attempt to bring all of this great work together into something that's hopefully usable. And yeah, I think this may be a little bit off topic, but being really clear that like the idea of kind of the importance of looking at white supremacy is not an Ashley and Lorien idea, or you know, something that came from any white scholar at all. You know, this is something that's really been a huge part of critical theories, in particular critical race theory. And just feeling like there has been a lot of silence on these topics by white scholars, and that, you know, perhaps to move forward, there has to be some element of meeting in the middle. And if I may, and to steal from Netflix's show Dear White People, you know, I think it was a little bit of an intention to be like, by white people for white people. You know, let's get together and do something here. I took that question very far away from the original point, but
No. I appreciate that. You guys list out a lot of original thinkers, you know, bell hooks, and the like, who sort of shaped this, where you guys are at. I mean, you give a lot of credit to, I mean, where credit's due, right? To the people who have been talking about this for decades. I mean, James Baldwin, you know, like, have been talking about this for eons, and yet it still remains this sort of nebulous thing in family science in terms of white supremacy. And so it seemed like you guys were trying to sort of say, we're standing on the shoulders of giants and we're yelling with our white megaphone to see if anybody will listen, among the white academics and educators out there.
I actually feel like that was one of the tensions that we had, and one of the reasons the paper took us such a long time to write. It wasn't for lack of ideas or lack of importance or lack of guiding theories. It was this fear that all we're doing is just saying this in a different, maybe in a different package, in a different platform, but suddenly having some sort of authority on it was something I think Ashley and I both really wrestled with, because of all of these things, because it's been said better, because it's, you know, been researched in the places that it matters. And so, yeah, that was definitely, I think, a really large tension for both of us to navigate.
yeah, and I think continues to be, right. And that, thanks for bringing that up, Lauren. I think it's such an important part of the conversation, and how we navigate this, you know, how we honor the people whose ideas these actually are, and that this isn't just another co-opting. So yeah, it's complicated, and certainly I think, you know, we just had to go for it, right? And you know, wait and see. And I think we're both really committed to hearing feedback, that perhaps that's what we have done, and you know, that's how we can kind of move forward and get better.
Yeah, there's this tension between, you know, if anybody should be naming white supremacy, it's white folks, about our own actions, our own behavior, the ways that we uphold the system. On the other hand, we are coming into this later than we should have as a group. And so how to be responsible, I suppose, with that power, or that, and try and name something real and something that's literally killing people and has been for hundreds of years now. Right. So when you guys, I mean, I should show you my copy. There's highlights all over my copy as I was reading it, and sort of figuring out what to do. In fact, there's a few that are sort of starred that I wanted to ask you about. Is that okay if I quote you back to you? Is that weird?
Please do.
It'd be great to hear. I've never been quoted back to myself.
It's a new level, I think, you know, professionally, when people start quoting me back to you. So there's a couple of things. So, you know, I was a baby of the 80s and 90s, and I was raised in a deeply colorblind upbringing, right? Like religious upbringing, you know, God loves everybody, all of that. And you guys really sort of deal with that, and then also talk about how that really allowed for white supremacy to continue in many ways. It wasn't actually an antidote. It was what allowed it to sort of maintain itself under the surface. So one of the things you said was, just as a spider must weave a web that is invisible to its prey, the invisibility of white supremacy has served to maintain its dominance. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you were trying to get across, maybe in terms of colorblindness or in your attempts to sort of name this invisible force?
Mm-hmm. Should I take this one, Ashley?
I think so. This is, I acutely remember that you wrote this. Maybe that's a silly, it's very clear to me, you know, kind of who wrote what in our different styles, but yeah, please, if you don't mind, Lorien, I think you'd be the better choice.
I think, so where my first real initial experience with even being aware of white supremacy, I should say. I mean, I knew of it as this thing that we've labeled as the KKK or whatever. That was always very clear to me. Mm-hmm. But I actually did my dissertation while I was living in New Zealand, and I was working with Maori, which are the indigenous people of New Zealand. And I remember, you know, I was starting to encounter all of this literature that we don't have a lot of access to because, you know, we might not publish articles about New Zealand specific ideas because it doesn't affect this larger complex of scientific literature from the United States. So long story short, so I'm encountering all of these new theories, and I really landed on one called settler colonialism. And they talk a lot about the role of the settler is to disappear indigenous peoples while also bringing in and appropriating exogenous peoples. So in the United States, we've disappeared all of the Native Americans, American Indians, and then we've brought in, we've enslaved people, brought them in, and then now we're using immigrant labor. And so the point of settler colonialism is talking about how the trick to maintain that is to make that invisible to the settlers, to make them feel like they have become indigenous to the land, that they have the right to the land. And so as I was thinking about white supremacy and how did we move from this de jure, so having legally recognized it is in our laws that white people are superior, so therefore people of color get less. So how did we move from that? And so I started thinking again about that adaptability that even settlement took and that white supremacy surely has. And part of that adaptability then has been to become invisible to people like me who think and grow up that white supremacy is the KKK. And because it's invisible, I don't have to have any ownership of it. And I don't have to do anything about it, besides being, you know, thinking it's an ugly thing that shouldn't exist. And so it sort of frees white people from having to acknowledge itself by becoming sort of invisible in this covert operating force. And so I think for me, I also grew up in a colorblind society, right? You know, I grew up in the 80s, and it was impolite to talk about race because everybody's the same and we all have the same chances. And that, I just think, again, is the trick of white supremacy, because the people who were telling me that, they, you know, my family loved me and they, you know, I think they had all the good intentions, but it really made it possible for me to not be aware of the differences and the violence and the, you know, the extreme difference between those who are in dominant and subordinate positions.
Yeah, as you were talking, all I could think about was all the history books I read as a child, right? If you think back on like social studies and history, and like I have kids now in school, and so I'm like watching their materials really closely, but mostly because I've become aware of part of the trick happened there. And that sort of really early education where I was told things like, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and then everything was fine. And then Martin Luther King came along, which was like, by the way, a long time later. And then this happened. And like, when you actually start looking at the timeline and you start looking and you start hearing about sort of real events of what happened and reading history that's more honest about the racial stratification and white supremacy and the ways that it was enacted at the level of legal processes, right? It's not like this stuff was illegal and criminals were doing it, right? That's how we talk about the KKK, is like this criminal, outlandish. These were like, it was legal to like lynch and like all kinds of things, right? And I didn't learn any of that until I was way too far into my 20s, that those things actually happened. And so it seems to me maybe that is that part of that colonialism or that sort of becoming a native as a white person, even in land we've stolen, is that we then write the history books that show us in that kind of light.
Absolutely. You know, the United States started when Christopher Columbus landed, you know, and the American Indian were these friendly bunch of folks that helped us survive and helped us take care of the land. And then they kind of disappeared off into the, you know, we don't talk about the brutality. We don't talk about how we purposely disappeared people who are still here, right? Like they're still here and we're still disappearing them even today with COVID and how we're responding. So I mean, it's still all happening. And that's the one thing, not to make this about settler colonialism, but that's the one thing about the theory is that it's called an event. I mean, it's not an event, it's a structure, right? Like, because we think of it as the landing of Christopher Columbus is when settlement happened, but it's constantly happening. And we're constantly staking our claims, and white supremacy is what drives the right that we have to stake this claim.
Yeah, I'm wondering if, you know, because some of that narrative is so ingrained for most of us, I'm thinking about us in the United States, but I'm sure it's true in other countries where they've had colonial invasions, essentially, that it's part of what maybe makes moments like now where people are pushing on this, and you all do as well, like pushing on this narrative as like maybe not true, and maybe there's other history here, and maybe we need to talk about slavery for what it was, or maybe we need to acknowledge the connection between George Floyd and slavery and what happened after that, like, and what policing is, right? That because that narrative is so deep that it's almost like it feels a little bit like it's bubbling up to the surface now. More white supremacy feels more visible on some level as people are reacting so strongly to the shift. I don't know if you guys feel that way, but it's making me wonder how much, if you push on the other side of it, it becomes visible in some way.
I feel like I'm dominating the conversation about white supremacy, or this part of the paper of it. I think this is another tension that I hold, because that is my hope, right? That if we keep pushing and if we keep calling these things out, it will become clearer, and then white people will take ownership of it and admit it. And at the same time, in this current history, the people that are trying to do this work are also being pushed against more ferociously than in the past. And I think it's because there's such a bigger platform now for recognizing the truth of white supremacy, that then there's a bigger platform now for people who push against it and deny it. So I think it's a both and, right? It's just I think this is the battle that has to be kind of fought. And I don't know that it can be won, which is a sad thing to say, but unless we all can start to take this ownership of it.
Yeah, and it's certainly very complicated, and you know, just to kind of, for your students in the process, Lorien wrote a ton about settler colonialism and kind of all of these ideas that she was talking about. And ultimately it had to be removed from the paper for length, kind of that, you know, that the deep theoretical underpinnings of things. And, you know, a big part of this, I think, is also the individualism of at least the Western world. And I think that our paradigm of individualism really kind of has a lot of people feeling personally attacked, and we get a lot of those reactions of like, but I'm not racist, I'm a good person, and kind of the inability to take the leap from like, you very well, you know, may be a lovely person, and we're talking about this larger structural influence. So there are so many tensions, I think, that we see happening at this time, and some of them can be traced back to individualism, but of course there's not space in a x number of page article to really kind of get into all of the detail of kind of why this might be happening, or the very real tension that we're seeing at this time.
Yeah, actually, when I was reading the paper, I was thinking about how you guys were sort of opening all of these little boxes that you could like jump straight down into, you know, like white privilege, whoosh, color blindness, and then like, and, you know, and as someone who's done other reading on those topics, I was like, oh yeah, you could really, I mean, you've got a book here. Like if you really went deep, right, on all of these topics. So I hear what you're saying about like, in terms of what all the paper could include or probably should include, you have to think about all the own structure and restrictions we have around writing. But it sounds like maybe some of this paper, at least for me, was like, man, if you got interested in this, you would have like just your reference section alone, you could just start going deep into these different topics in terms of better understanding maybe some of the connections you guys are making. Yeah.
For sure. And I think part of it with the opening the boxes is just saying, here are all these boxes exist, and this is real. And so for you, the reader, find the box that's most important to you and dive into it.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Ashley, were you going to say something else?
Nope.
Okay. So I thought it was great when you guys talked about the multiple supremacies, right? That there's an intersectionality piece here around white supremacy is maybe an organizing supremacy, but then all these other supremacies can likely latch on and sort of reinforce maybe in some way. In fact, I had this image in my head of like other spiders on the same web, just sort of spinning with, in terms of creating a really secure web, right? In some ways, I think about like white queer folks, right, who can still show up and support white supremacy, even as there is homophobia and transphobia occurring for queer communities. So I don't know which one of you wants to talk about that in terms of the intersectionality nature, or that problem of multiple supremacies.
I have an idea. I'll give the intro to how we navigated this in our paper, and then I think that Lorien might perhaps be more knowledgeable on the topic. But we, as we've kind of mentioned, we had multiple academic freakouts while doing this paper, and one of them was, are we just like trying to are we either reinventing intersectionality and like taking it over and acting like it's a new thing, or are we completely missing intersectionality by this focus? Like, which of these kind of extreme directions have we gone? And I think in our timeline that also held things up. And in our discussions about intersectionality, it was useful for us to kind of think about, okay, like if we like this metaphor, if we're going to buy into it, how can we extend the metaphor? What are the points of connection that the web is attached to? What are the other trees in the area, or whatever it is that also have webs, and how are all of these things interconnected? So I think, I think around the conclusion, we talk about a Bell Hooks quote where she essentially says, you can't focus on one sort of ism and forget all others. All of these systems of power and oppression are inextricably connected. They all hold each other up. And if you focus on one and really ignore the other ones, then you're truly undermining your own efforts, because you're strengthening this thing that you're ignoring. So from a kind of zoomed out perspective, I think that's the importance of the connection, right? Or how this really matters, that we look at the whole picture. I do believe Lorien spent some time as well, kind of, detailing really specifically what white supremacy has to do with, patriarchy and heterosexism and cissexism and, all of these things. And also, I think it was something that ultimately we didn't have space for, but it's certainly, I'm not sure, do you have, I don't want to put you on the spot, Lorien, but I know that you did some of that work of kind of detailing how these different systems are connected. Anything that you'd like to add?
I will make a shameless plug and say that I have a paper coming out in Women in Therapy, and it talks specifically about sexual violence as a tool of white supremacy. And it does another sort of historical deep dive about how we sexualized Indigenous women, to try to kind of, well, I won't go too far into it, and both Indigenous women and women who were enslaved, while also vilifying men, right? And so then it also goes on to talk about how white women participated in this. And so it goes a historical, but then it moves into the current day and talks about why white women might support policies that are not actually pro women. And I am intentionally being cis focused right here. But in that, it also goes through, again, like this web of these interconnecting intersectional identities, and how, in my view, and so because I am taking this from a critical lens of white supremacy, I am connecting all of these isms to white supremacy. And of course, we could take it from any other critical lens and see the same, but because this is my focus and because this is my interest, it is sort of, it's like once you see something, you can't unsee it. And so I'm so narrowly focused on it. But yeah, but we can't also ignore all of the other intersectional challenges that come up.
Yeah, well, since you brought it up, I'm going to ask the question, because one of the questions I keep getting is, why do so many white women vote against themselves? Like,
stay tuned for my paper.
Coming in the paper. I'm going to need that paper, because I do think I'm following what you're saying, that issue of violence, sexual violence in particular, that's perpetrated more on women, and then the ways that white women have, this is going to sound terrible, but benefited, right, in some ways, in terms of the violence that gets perpetrated on women of color. And then the ways that so I'm a couples therapist too, and I'm thinking through all of these. When you said that, I was like, oh, uh-oh, we're going to just go down this rabbit hole. But I think it's an important one because of the way white women prop up patriarchy and white supremacy. And I, in my experience, are very unaware of how they do that, or that these things are even connected.
So I can give you a brief kind of spoiler alert. And again, this is something that I feel like it's very hard for me to talk about, because in some ways I feel like I'm victim blaming for women who support, policies and men and that I don't agree with. But the sort of analysis that I came up with through this deep dive into white supremacy and colonialism is that women became more empowered by mothering. And so, because the more children that a man was attached to a man, the more land the man got and the more rights he got. And so it benefited women to then support sort of the criminalization of sexual relationships with Black women, and also with Native women. And so it's very tied to like this maternalist politics and land ownership, and finding one's power by leaning into the power of men. And still that continues today. If we think, there was I can't remember if he was a congressman or a senator from North Dakota, I believe, Kramer, who really made calls to frontiers women when Brett Kavanaugh was up for the Supreme Court nomination, and saying that today's women are, they're victims, and they're letting themselves be victims because back in the days of the prairie, they could stand up for themselves, almost saying that it was like women's jobs to be sexually violated. And that if we just stopped talking about that, then we could get more rights. And so it's not even that it's like just in the past, it's literally happening now, and the calls for women to be frontiers women and all of these things. So that probably was like a messy response, but I would be happy to send you the paper once it's in press.
But I think that's one of the really important things I have found in teaching and educating is we need to connect the past to the present. And when you can do that, when you can draw the line like you just did, people go, oh, because it's really easy to think of white supremacy maybe as like this historical footnote of this thing that happened when we enslaved people. We don't do that anymore. And we sort of like move along, and then we don't see its interconnectedness to gender that you were just talking about, and violence, and we see it so back there. And so I appreciate that sort of connection, because I think that moment, like during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, like there's a lot of women I saw on social media going, like essentially like having what I would consider PTSD reactions to the experience, because of how much of patriarchy and white supremacy was on display, as well as the violence that it commits against women. And so I think the emotional reaction to the event, or the events, probably speaks to what you're describing there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's that interconnectedness between race and gender and all the other isms around that. And so I'm curious, you know, when I got to the end, I was like, so what do we do? Right? Like, this is always the question white people have, like, so what do we do next? What's the action item? What's on my to-do list? And you guys offer some ideas, and I think in terms of research and theory, and I'd be curious for you guys to kind of talk through maybe what you are coming away from this study with, or what sticks out to you as really important for our field, but maybe even just for, you know, the everyday student who's trying to figure out what to do about this.
I can speak to kind of the broader, some of the things in our paper. We in the kind of end parts, the implication section, the strategy section, we draw a lot on the work of Margaret Hagerman, who, you know, has spent years with largely middle upper class white families, kind of looking at how whiteness and kind of white racial power and privilege is kind of reproduced in families. So in short, like what are we teaching our kids about race, and how are we reproducing these ideologies, probably largely unconsciously. You know, it goes back to that idea of invisibility and how this becomes so insidious. And so, you know, I think that then speaks to our first suggestion about what to do is like, let's name this stuff, let's talk about it. And it doesn't have to be the discussion of kind of white guilt was actually a reviewer asked us to discuss white guilt and white fragility. And you know, it's really not about guilt. I think we're all therapists here one way or another. I think that we know that guilt isn't particularly motivating. So it's not about sitting in guilt. It's about acknowledgement and accountability. And that, so just by kind of, you know, having these conversations, talking about it more, naming things, that's a really good place to start. And there are many scholars who have recommended as an on the ground approach, like, look, the holidays are coming up, you know, who's your first family member who you're going to pick to kind of have these conversations with. So zooming out, research world, you know, I think this is kind of where the work of Burton and colleagues comes into play, where we're not measuring race and its effects, we're measuring racial stratification and its effects. And that if we, you know, I think part of the utility of the web metaphor and what Krieger talks about is that if we have this web and it's well mapped. So, you know, we know discrimination matters, we know poverty matters, access to resources like education. And if we base our prevention programs on those things, they'll be useful, hopefully, in mitigating the effects of those things, but they don't change the reality of those things ever. So until we kind of zoom out and look at the creator of the web, and I believe she kind of talks about snipping web strands, like, you know, if we have a program aimed at addressing the effects of discrimination, we can kind of work to snip that strand, but we're not doing more to dismantle the system that allows discrimination and recreates it, and so on and so forth. So that was a very long response, but yeah, kind of start with naming it. You know, instead of using race as a the kind of first variable in your path model, zoom out. And even if you can't do it in the analysis, but you can kind of do it in your theorizing of the implications, to zoom out a little bit and kind of look at true causes, so to speak. This is long and spinning. I'll pause.
It is right. When I read your paper and what I hear you saying now, and please tell me if I'm getting this wrong, it sounds like you're critiquing some of the I'm going to call them excuses we have for white people about why they don't do anything. Like white fragility for me has been a helpful concept, but sometimes people can get stuck there and go, well, it's just my guilt, or it's just my this. And it means that I don't have to be accountable for my actions or the ways that I participate. Is that part of what you're saying?
Definitely. There's a paper that we cite by Smith who talks about ignorant culpability. And as a writer, she kind of traces, she uses, just in the opening part of her paper, she uses the example of a doctor who administers a fatal amount of oxygen to a patient because this doctor didn't know that amount of oxygen would be fatal. And she kind of introduces this idea of, is this doctor not culpable? Is he not responsible because he didn't know? Or is it that he is in fact culpable because he had the responsibility to do the background work to know what, a fatal amount of oxygen would be? And I'm sure that my telling of this is not nearly as good as the paper and oversimplified, but we do get into this sort of, there is a lot of not knowing about these topics. When I look at my family and where I come from, people don't know, and they haven't had the opportunity to be educated on these topics necessarily. So there is some element that we have to look at of like, can we fault people for not knowing what they don't know? And then also sort of look to, if we're talking about accountability and the academy, that if as academics, it's our job to educate, then, at the very least, we have culpability and responsibility to do the background work to kind of spread these ideas. But certainly it's complicated. And yeah, to just kind of get back to your original question of, is it okay to not know, or to use not knowing as a response, or to use, guilt or feelings of shame as kind of a shield? And I think for us, for academics, and it's not okay. It's our job to know as much as we can and be informed. And
particularly people working in the field of health. I mean, it seems to me, if we're interested in creating a healthy community, whether we're talking about family therapy or we're talking about family policy that impacts, the health of families in our communities, our nation, it seems like falling on the ignorant sword is really, maybe to your point, irresponsible. And we are culpable if we're just going to go, oh, I didn't know. When there's really, particularly in a university setting, so many resources available and probably people available in terms of educating ourselves, that it would take willful ignorance, or a desire to not know, for whatever reason. I think the whole issue of being accountable as a white person is the thing that sometimes really gets people. Like, they don't want to change. They don't actually want to do anything. They'd like to feel bad about it or have empathy, but not necessarily change their lives or their behaviors or who they vote for or whatever. I don't know if that follows kind of where you were headed.
No idea where I was headed, Katie. Yeah, it's very complicated, and there are lots of stories about these topics that I think also get in the way. This might be a little bit off topic, but you were talking previously about what's written in our history books, and there's been a movement to reauthor that. This is my narrative therapist self coming out. There has been a movement to reauthor that, and we see folks calling, to take down Confederate monuments. And there's this other discourse that comes in saying, you're trying to erase our history. This is our history. Why are you trying to erase it? And that discourse, I think, really gets in the way that none of this is about erasure. We've done a ton of that already. In fact, that part of this is about telling a different story, maybe one that's more factually accurate. And also one that's authored by people who have been silenced.
Right.
Perhaps a tangent, but what you were speaking of made me kind of think of that element of things, and just the many kind of political discourses we have going that I think unfortunately kind of get in the way, and that again we have to kind of call those out and be able to talk about them to do anything about it, to move forward.
And if I could, I want to touch on something that one of you mentioned, and I can't remember who, but like the uncomfortableness of it, and that it's hard. And when I started doing this work, I had so much guilt and so much shame about what I didn't know and what I probably perpetrated on people without knowing. And the guilt, I think, is just to go back to that idea of the spider web as the one way that we cover it up, right? And we make it translucent because it's so uncomfortable that we don't want to see it. And that's why we're taught, or at least I was taught, that it's impolite to talk about race because it makes white people uncomfortable. Not because it makes people of color uncomfortable, because they have to talk about it, right? It is in their face and a part of their lives always. And we white people have the privilege of ignoring it. And so it's very uncomfortable, it's impolite. And so even not on a policy level, but just the granular in our families and our friend circles, it's difficult. And I think that's why for me, it always sounds so simple about, I think the first step is just owning it and recognizing it and naming it. It sounds simple, but that's genuinely, like, I think the hardest milestone, because once you can do that, then it becomes clearer actions you can take and where you might want to intervene. Maybe you want to intervene at the family level, the school level, the policy level, but it's not until you're actually coming from a place of solid footing and not coming from a place of guilt, because that can just lead to sort of like paternalism and doing things for others, and really recognizing why you're doing it for yourself and not for others. And I think that that's why the first thing is just education and ownership.
Well, and in the willingness to name it, sustain whatever comes back at you. I think about, I had a professor once who said, if you have privilege, you need to use it, and be willing to name things and say things, and then sustain the blowback. Like, I tell my class about, when the Black Lives Matter movement became bigger after Trayvon Martin, and then the series of names that we've begun acknowledging now after all these years. But that when I became vocal about it, about supporting that movement, the backlash I got. But really, what happened to me? Like nothing, right? I'm still here. My parents still invite me home, even though they've never quite understood it. Maybe some people unfriended me. I don't know, right? Like, but there was a sustaining of the backlash that I had to get comfortable with and be okay with and stand in anyway, which, I think for a lot of people, once they get the backlash, it goes, oh, whoa, whoops, and they kind of go mute again or quiet, and don't say it anymore, or go, maybe I got it wrong. And so I think there's that where you have to start to recognize, like what did you really lose, right? The truth is probably not that much. Like, I didn't lose my job. There's no violence that happened to me as a result, right? The actual implications are smaller than we realize, apart from the discomfort, apart from the guilt. If we're willing to just kind of keep standing there, and not look away or not unsee it. I mean, you talked earlier about, like, once you see it, you can't not see it. And maybe once you name it, you just got to keep naming it everywhere it sort of shows up.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And maybe, like, I think about my students and sort of readying them for, like, just keep standing there. Like, don't stop. And in the continually naming it, there's power in that naming it. And now other people have to contend with it. If I'm also following kind of what you're saying in terms of, although it sounds small, it's quite big. Begin sort of pointing at the web everywhere you see it.
Exactly. I think that's why people experience blowback when they start naming it, because the other people are uncomfortable and they don't want to own it and they don't want to have to deal with it. And so I think taking your sort of analytical view of, so what really happened to me, is such an important one. And I don't think that we might not do that enough. You know, I don't know that I sit here and think frequently, well, did I actually lose anything by writing this article or by talking to this with my clients or my students? And no, right?
Yeah. The other thing I'm sort of feeling from the two of you, but I also sort of read in the article, was a deep sense of humility about this topic. So I'm curious if you guys can talk a little bit about that. I know there's a concept now in psychotherapy and called cultural humility, but it seems like there's a sense of like, if we're going to name it and see white supremacy and the web it's created, it requires quite a bit of humility on the part of academics in this case, right, that you're talking to, where humility and ego are so sometimes harder in that realm. But I think generally for us, like, humility is not always the easiest thing to bring forward.
I'm finding this an oddly complicated question, Katie, and I might take it in an unintended direction. But yeah, certainly I think, gosh, as academics, we have so much power, or, at least for me as a white academic, what you and Lorien were talking about, like, I'm not going to lose my job because of this paper or any other paper. I have very little risk. And I'm not sure if knowing that is humility. But I do think that if we, what we're doing with having a conversation about these topics, like, it's not just to pay lip service to it, it's to move forward and get better. And I think that there has to be humility in that process. I have to be willing to get whatever feedback I'll get about this or anything else that I am talking about. And I have to be willing to make real change and attempt to do better, to not just sit with any discomfort of that feedback, but to actually address it in the future. So I'm not sure if that's humility. I find myself sometimes being confused about what humility actually is, what it looks like in real life. But certainly we have to be willing to take feedback and make change. And in a topic such as this, to acknowledge that, like, this, it's not our idea or our work, or that we're just kind of translators of this thing that so many others have done. And it, as Lorien said, in probably, much better ways. But yeah.
Yeah, I think when I was doing my research in New Zealand, I was really fortunate. I was at the Family Center, who started the Just Therapy model, and their thing was that it's 3 branches of an organization. It's Pākehā, which are basically white people, Pacifica, so people with Pan-Pacific Island heritage, and Maori. And each arm was responsible for their people, but then they are also always accountable to the others. And the way that worked was by being sure of your cultural identity. And that was something that I learned while I was there, is that I have to be sure of my cultural identity and my race and what that means as much as I can. But I do have to have humility in knowing that I will never really know beyond an academic sense what my race means to another person, and especially another person that I might be in a room with as a therapist or a teacher. And so that's for me where I try to enter into these relationships with humility and being aware that just because I have this academic and lived experience of what white supremacy is, I have to be able to take a back seat when someone may be sharing their experience with me, or maybe pushing against what I'm saying, because I don't have all the answers. And I think that's, so I don't know that I have humility, but I try to enter into these places and relationships with humility.
Yeah, that there's a piece of having to name and understand who we are, and not pretend to be something else. You're making me think of, I've certainly had moments where what you were describing earlier, like, I want to be the good white person. I don't want to be associated with those bad white people. I mean, I think that's a really common place to be. And yet, if I'm going to own my identity, my origin, right, from a white family, from a white space, raised, steeped in white supremacy, I just have to name it and own it. And I can't pretend as if that didn't happen to me, or I'm something else now, that is still there and something to contend with. And I don't know, like my dad had this old phrase, don't get too big for your britches, that he would say all the time. But sometimes that resonates with me in moments like this, where you sort of have to, like, you are what you are. And we can get better at it by learning from people and with people, as opposed to sort of coming over people, or trying to pretend we're something else. Am I following some of what you're
It's so funny because when you asked about humility, I thought about that saying, because my mom always said that to me. So yeah.
Well, the irony, though, in my white family is that saying was also about being nice. And I think, right, like, so when I was a doc student, one of my faculty said, well, you know what the word nice means? And I'm like, I mean, what? Like, what do you mean? What? Like but the definition of it in its original sort of form meant naivete. So to be nice is to be naive.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then I went, oh, like that explains nice white people to me now, right? In terms of this sort of ignorance. What's the phrase you guys used in the paper?
Culpable ignorance.
That it goes back to this being nice, but nice really means stay ignorant, stay naive, stay sort of dumb to what's happening, and just play along.
Yeah, stay silent.
Mm-hmm. Right. And at least in my white evangelical Christian community, nice was about, particularly as a woman, a girl, right, is to be naive, and just to go along with what's happening and follow the leaders, the male white leaders, right, in that regard.
And smile.
Oh God, yes, please smile. Please wear your hair a particular way. Please, don't ask too many questions. Kind of go along. And so it seems like maybe that's another part of this in terms of the differentiation for me from humility as opposed to being nice. I almost like hate the word nice now after learning all of that. But
I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Either I just remember my brain would. My family makes so much more sense to me. And then, but at the time, I didn't connect it to race. And the longer I've been in this work of trying to understand white supremacy and what it is to be anti-racist, I'm like, oh my God, I feel like these are connected in terms of the way that we perpetrate that invisibility piece and that staying ignorant, or culpable ignorance, right? Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, this has been so much fun. I could sit and talk to you all day. But I'm curious, as we're sort of getting here to the end, if you guys have particular parts of the article that you wanted to be sure we talked about that we haven't gotten to yet, that you think are important or you want to emphasize in some way.
Lorien and I are looking at each other, just waiting.
No, I mean, I think for me, I think the most important thing is to recognize color blindness. And so, we've touched on that. And I think that's because I do think that's how it's continuing today. And I feel like even more right now, we're being asked to be nice and be colorblind. And so yeah, so that was great.
For you, Ashley?
I don't know. I find myself I have it in the background. I'm paging through it like, what? What does this say? And do I need to repeat something?
Yeah, so I have something I was going to quote back to you.
Okay.
So one of them, what struck me, and I feel like is the like essence of being a systemic thinker, and yet somehow around this topic we have missed it over and over again. You guys say on page 73, the field is ready to take the next step to acknowledge that we are guilty of mistaking symptoms for causes. And you cite Leonardo 2004. But I think for me, that's like, yeah, we've been saying this about diagnosis, about all kinds of things all along, and we haven't done it. I shouldn't say that. It's been done about race, but we haven't listened to it. There have been thinkers out there and theorists and family therapists. I think of like Ken Hardy and folks like him who've utilized critical race theory forever in terms of their work, but we haven't really taken it up in terms of the general body of research in the field and theorizing in the field. So thoughts, comments about that from you all? More staring at each other through Zoom.
This is a little off topic, but it's just you bring up Ken Hardy, and something that very well may be happening or has happened is Ken Hardy or another brilliant scholar has actually proposed a ton of brilliant ideas for moving forward, and it got silenced for whatever reason, or didn't catch hold, which I think is important to note. Sorry, I think my brain is tired and losing steam. Will you remind me of the question, Katie, so I can reattach to where I was going with this?
Well, I was saying that, there's a point in here you guys make where we've been mistaking the symptoms for the causes, and that there are people who've been talking about this for a long time, like Ken Hardy and others in the field, and yet it somehow hasn't caught fire. Like it somehow hasn't sort of permeated then how we're approaching any topic, particularly if you have a white sample, right? There's always this sort of like, oh, too bad we had all white people, but like not then this discussion about what that might mean in terms of the results or in terms of racial stratification or white supremacy. And instead we sort of becomes a footnote in our limitation section, and it doesn't, take hold as like something to interrogate.
Thank you. Sorry, that helps me reacclimate to the conversation and where I am. Yeah, I think perhaps part of this, we are human development and family science, and we've seen some scholars as things have gotten more macro in our discipline. Lorien is someone who does a lot of work on policy. And the political arena, and as things have gotten kind of more macro in our discipline, we've had some people come back and argue this is human development and family science. The family is the system. We're not trying to go bigger. This isn't political science. And there's this sort of battle between saying, well, policies and all of these macro systems affect the family. It's inextricably connected. So I think as a field, I would agree with you. We've done okay at saying, I'm in addiction work right now. We've done okay at saying addiction doesn't happen intra-individually. It happens in family systems. There are all of these factors that happen. And we've been good at being kind of systems thinkers in that realm, but not necessarily kind of extending, we might know that poverty is a significant risk factor for families, and kind of looking at how we support individual families living in poverty. But we, to my knowledge, we haven't necessarily done the work of like, okay, well, why are certain families kind of funneled into poverty disproportionately, and how do we cut those links to begin with? And I think it takes all sorts. I had a professor in my PhD who said, I'm a researcher. It's not my job to do the political part. I'm producing a piece of research that I'll send off, and perhaps it is my job to send it to the right channels. But this is my job. And, you know, I think we could critique that, or we could say it's true. It does take all of us, and that it's about building a network of folks who can kind of connect all of these pieces, that, you know, that this isn't meant to be a commentary that like your micro level work doesn't matter. It does matter. And, you know, that we might also consider intervening on these larger, more macro areas. Sorry for my, you know, my brain just decompensated.
It's fine. We're all exhausted at this moment. Hours, so
2020, Katie, it's 2020.
Yeah. But I think you reminded me of just how important it is to have multiple voices involved. And like, I think about all my blind spots, right? Particularly as a white person, but also in all the different social locations I occupy. And so when you have multiple voices within research projects, within classrooms, within faculty departments, you know, faculty in your department, or in a community agency, like that becomes really vital for bringing together the right people to offer but to offer different ways of seeing it that might allow for us to get better at this.
Yeah, we can't do it all, right? One person.
I think this is actually one of my biggest kind of, I don't know if the argument's the right word, but sticking points with how we educate. As a master's trainee, how I was educated, and then in my PhD program. And I think we create a feedback loop. And so what's going in is what's coming out. And until we have things like this, where you're having this article be an assigned part, and then hopefully, you know, your students will watch this. So that's a different piece of information. So maybe new information can come out. I think about going to these, you know, conferences, and it's rare to see people talking about these really difficult topics that really impact our families. And it's getting better. And I will say that, but I mean, before, when I started going to family therapy conferences, it just wasn't happening. And then I think it's like when we're training master students, I think we have to talk about, there is this policy world that we could be a part of. You don't have to, but you could. And because a lot of people don't know that they'd be interested in policy until they start doing it. Or there's research, and research is really important. And so it's sort of like giving students this idea that there are more things to do with your degree than become a therapist, and that all are valuable. And that as we do that, my hope is that people who grow up to be policy people who grow up to be therapists, and those who grow up to be researchers will start having connections to each other and actually start communicating with each other, because otherwise we're just going to keep making research that nobody reads, you know. I hate to say that. We're going to be operating alone in our rooms as therapists, and then the policy people are going to be out there like, we don't have anything to support us when we go meet with legislators. So it is also important, and I don't know that each person can do each job, but we have to be able to be connected and understand the importance of our job as well as the others.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's a great note to end on, because I think that's so important in terms of really thinking about, if we're really systemic thinkers in a therapy room, we need to think beyond the therapy room in terms of the impact of other things on the people we're seeing, but also our impact sort of out and beyond us. And that's an empowering thing, I think, for people to consider, particularly our grad students, but also other folks, just about how our reach is bigger than we think. If we can start naming this and seeing it. Absolutely. Well, I so appreciate y'all's time and your willingness to come talk. I know my students will benefit from getting to hear from you all, because it's one thing to read an article, it's another thing to hear the people who wrote it kind of talk about it. So I appreciate your time and talent and your wonderfully expansive brains that put this down on paper. So thank you.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.